Okay, so we're going to get started today. Happy Monday morning. It's rainy. Don't know how that happened. It's kind of snuck up on. I wasn't expecting it, that's for darn sure. So you got two handouts today. We'll talk about the exercise just a little bit. But the first one I want to bring up, I'm not going to go over it in too much detail because we'll spend a lot of time talking about it on Wednesday. But I figured I'd give it to you so you can start thinking about it. I'm not really expecting you to work on it yet. But it's the advanced photo editing assignment. So this is where we really get into what Photoshop can do, combining images together, etc. I'll show you a bunch of examples on class on Wednesday. This is due on Monday, the 30th of September. So it's not next Monday, it's the Monday after. Sorry, I'm just making sure I've got that. So you end up with 2 weekends in between for this one. But it is due on a Monday, not on a Wednesday. I should also remind you that your first assignment, 101, is due on Wednesday. So make sure it's posted before I start talking on Wednesday. I also want that paper copy. It can be sent just to the computer across the way, the printer across the way, nothing fancy, no fancy prints, gloss, any of that kind of stuff. I would like it to be in color. It helps in its representation a little bit if it's in color. So fork over the 25 cents and give me the color version. A couple notes on assignment 102. You have to use your own photos. So you can't just go online and find photos that are online and then try to combine them together. And there's a reason for that. Part of it is because I want it to be your work. The other part is it's really hard to match up lighting conditions and merge images together when you're just picking images at random. You have to spend a lot of time looking through images to get the right combinations. We'll talk about that when we talk about integrating images a little bit later in the class. All right. Sorry, just making sure I got everything. You guys can read through that, and like I said, we'll talk about it a lot more next class. So today, we're going to start with an introduction to high dynamic range photography and panoramic photography. I kind of combine these two together. It's really, what it boils down to is we're going to learn about masking in Photoshop today. We're going to get our feet wet with masking. And so the demo portion is the really important part. The slides that I'm going to show you are a bunch of pictures, bunch of examples so that you can kind of understand what it is that we're talking about when I refer to both of these. So let's look at first HDR photography, or high dynamic range photography, and talk about what it is. Basically, it's a set of techniques that allow a greater dynamic range, hence high dynamic range, of light between the lightest and darkest areas in your image. And really what it is it's a way of mimicking how we see something. And I think the easiest way of explaining this is if you've ever tried to take a picture of a sunset, when you look at the picture afterward, it doesn't look nearly as good as the sunset looked. Now, some of that is you're looking at it on a screen as opposed to seeing it in person. But there's another part of it that is your eye just is better than the camera. And that's fundamentally the truth of it. And so what we do is we take three different images. The one in the middle here is theoretically the correct exposed one, what the camera thinks is correct. And then we deliberately under and overexpose. So we have one image that's overexposed. We're getting the light areas. We're getting detail in the light areas. And we have one image that is deliberately darker or underexposed. And we take all three of those images and we combine them together to make one image. And it's through this process that we start to create an image that looks a lot more like our eyes see the sunset. So there's two reasons that we do this. The first one is really an artistic reason. It's we wanted to represent that sunset and have it look like the sunset. Maybe we wanted to exaggerate that particular view. We wanted to make the colors even brighter. Those are definitely things that we can do. We also want to mimic how the human eye sees the scene. And so when I've talked a lot already about, oh, our eyes are so much better than a camera. And the truth is that they are. And the reason that they are is not because our resolution is better or whatever. What it has to do with is the fact that our eyes can adapt to the scenes very, very quickly. It's really our eyes plus our brains. So if we're in this room and you look down at the shadows, you can see detail. You look up, you see outside, you can see detail. Our brains are processing and our eyes are adjusting for that high dynamic range really, really fast. So it's a live image. So we're seeing everything. We're seeing detail in the shadows. We're seeing detail in the sky. And as we flip back and forth, we can see them. Now, the older you get, and most of you are all youngins, so you're not experiencing this yet, your eyes start to get tired, and it's really hard for them to adjust as quickly. And so you'll notice when you're in a dark room and then you suddenly walk outside, it's like, oh, I can't see. That's because your eyes aren't adjusting as fast. So it does go downhill as you get a little bit older. But essentially what we're trying to do with these high dynamic range images is we're trying to mimic the way that our eyes see it. Now it's a static image, so we have to kind of adapt over the course of the image to make that work. The other piece of this puzzle is that we can use high dynamic range or HDR images as part of our rendering processes. So when we're doing 3D modeling and we go to, say, work in V-Ray and we want a backdrop, this should make sense. We use these images because they contain so much information that when the camera exposes, when the rendering engine exposes the sky in a certain setting with certain lighting conditions, it looks like the sky. If you change the lighting conditions, the sky changes. So it's a complete kind of separate purpose. It's not the pretty purpose. It's the fundamental purpose for when we're doing renderings and whatever. So when you take 136 with me, which hopefully you all will, we'll talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about HDR images because it's a really important part of the background of your renderings. So there is that component as well. Tone mapping is essentially the way that we take this high dynamic range image with all this information in it and we break it down into something that we can see, something that looks nice, something that's graphic. So we're simplifying it a little bit. We're displaying that HDR image on a non-HDR device, i.e. your computer screen or a printout, etc. It can be applied to produce images with what we would call correct or nice HDR, or we can exaggerate it. So we can push that local contrast too far, and you can get images that start to not look so realistic. And I'll show you examples of both. And there's nothing wrong with exaggerating. It's just something that you do on purpose. So what we're doing in tone mapping is essentially we're looking at neighboring pixels in the image. So I would be picking like, 2 pixels right in here. And I'd say, OK, those have good contrast. Let me come up here. Those 2 pixels have good contrast. Let me come up here. Those 2 pixels have good contrast without trying to adjust the whole image. So we're going in pixel pairs versus doing the whole image at once. So we're adjusting the contrast locally as opposed to globally on the image itself. And that's how we get these nice images. So how do we do this? Well, no surprise, number one, Photoshop. That's what we're working on in this class. Merge to HDR is the automated Photoshop action that will help us do this. There's a bunch of adjustments that we can do after the fact. Photoshop actually has gotten pretty darn good at doing this. So there's not as much adjustment as we used to have a couple versions of Photoshop ago. There's no built-in tone mapping, but there's some stuff that's kind of similar that can help you out. And we'll go through that. It's available, obviously, on all the lab computers, which is great. And you'll be able to kind of work through it, and that's what we're going to work on today. There are a couple other standalone applications that do this. They also tend to have a Photoshop plugin, so you can be working in Photoshop and then go to the plugin to do this. These are meant for tone mapping. They're designed specifically for it. They're very, very good at it. They cost a little bit of money, no surprise, but you can get fantastic results out of them. Photomatix is one, and Aurora HDR is the other kind of competing piece of software. They're both about the same price range, neither of which are on the lab computers. So if it's something you're really interested in or you get excited about and you want to pursue it, by all means, go pursue it. But those would be the two kind of high-end options that do this. So let's look at some realistic examples so you can start to see what these images look like. Remember, all of these were combined using at least 3 images. So you're always taking at least 3 images, but you could do 5 or you could do 7, depending on how you set it up. So I think this is a great example of kind of the realistic application of something like this in a non-rendering form. So in this scenario, right up here at top, right, that one, this is our image that is just kind of our standard exposure. And you guys have probably done this before while you're inside. You say, wow, this space is really great. Let me take a picture of it. And you take that picture, and you get an image where all of the windows are just white. So you didn't capture anything of the whole scene. The alternative would be to try to expose it so those windows, we see what's going on in those windows, in which case all the rest of this would end up way too dark. So you really only get one or the other. So if you were somebody trying to sell this space or rent this space, you would want to showcase the fact that there is a beautiful view here, as opposed to having all the windows washed out. Perfect application for our HDR image. So we come down here to the HDR version of the same shot. Remember, we combined 3 images to get it, and now we're seeing all of the view that's happening outside of the windows. We're also seeing everything that's going on in the space. It's actually a little bit better exposed than the one up above. So we're getting all the information about what the space is like, and we're getting the view. If you're looking to rent this space or work in this space or live in this space, this one down here is far more valuable than this image up here. So if you're going to try to actually sell this space, it would make sense to pursue the HDR image. So that's a very practical application. And you see this is very common now in the world of real estate. Almost all the images that you're going to see on a real estate website, you're looking for a house, you're looking for an apartment, they're going to be HDR images because they want you to see all this light. And so here we have our standard photography examples on the left, the HDR photography examples on the right. And you can see it really does bring out a lot in these photos. You see a lot more detail. Another example here, an exterior shot. So I'm going to flip through these images rather quickly because it doesn't take too much to take them in. I'm just trying to get you guys thinking about HDR. A night shot like this is a great time to use HDR because if we were just taking this shot in one image, all of this stuff down here at the bottom in the bushes, all of that would be just black. It'd be really dark if we wanted to expose the skyscraper correctly. But by switching to the HDR, we get all of that data, plus we get the lights and the nighttime setting. So it's a really great way of kind of merging those two options together. So you're always going to see more detail in the shadows. Here underneath the building, we're seeing more detail in the shadows. It's not blacked out. So another great image, and if we look at it and like, oh yeah, that's another sunset image. I picked this image on purpose because this shows you, remember I always said that these come from at least 3 images. So if you have something that moves in the scene, that can be problematic. So here we go. There's one license plate of the same car. There's the second license plate of the same car. And the third one is kind of buried underneath in here somewhere because you took 3 images. Same thing happens with people that are moving. Like this person right here has no head. And so it depends on how the software processes the images as to whether you keep certain components or you don't keep certain components. Certainly we could go in after the fact and we could do some clever masking and keep somebody or get rid of somebody or that kind of thing. But it's definitely something to be aware of, that you can get this kind of artifacting because moving objects are going to move over the course of those 3 images. Even if you had a camera that did auto bracketing and you took the 3 images right together, boom, 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 there's still a little bit of a delay, so somebody would be moving. And that's definitely something you want to be aware of when it comes to this kind of image. Another example here, just bringing out the shadows. So like I said, I'm just going to flip through these just so you get a sense. Then we get into the creative examples. And I separate these from the realistic into the creative because essentially all the photographer has done is they've exaggerated the HDR processing just a little bit. So this one's not too far gone, but there's something kind of misty about it. Something just a little bit surreal about it. So it's just kind of bordering on that. As we push forward here, we start to get a little bit further. Like if you were here looking at this house, I doubt the sky was really that intense. So they're just pushing the boundary a little bit. But this is a great image. It looks like the haunted house because of that sky and that exaggerated contrast. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to exaggerate it. It's just something that you want to do consciously. You want to say, yes, I want to do this versus not do this. Now, there are times where you start to push it a little bit further. And you can see I'm building up into that. This one, it's almost becoming painterly. The sky is not quite as realistic as it was. It looks like it's almost a painting. That doesn't mean that it's not a beautiful image. then we can start to push it a little bit too far. So here's the classic Golden Gate Bridge shot. The clouds really didn't look like that on that day. I promise you. So we're pushing that just a little bit too far. And so you as the artist have to decide, is this too far to push it? So another example here, this one happens to be a panorama that's also a high dynamic range image. We'll get to that a little bit later. And now I'll start to flip through these a little bit more closely. So in here, you can see that texture on the deck is just kind of overdone. And so it's just pushing it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's just a different iteration of this HDR processing. I'm not quite sure why those two were in the exaggerated category. So that was high dynamic range photography. We're going to switch and we're going to talk about panoramic photography, with the two of which really kind of come together a lot. Anyway, it's involving similar techniques. So in the high dynamic range photo, we took 3 images and we combined them into one image. They happen to be the same image, so they laid one on top of the other. In a panoramic image, we're going to take multiple images and we're going to put them side by side so that they become seamless. So it's the same concept, it's just organized a little bit differently. So what is a panorama? It's a really wide angle view. A 360-degree panorama is one that curves all the way around behind you. And you guys have all seen these, you've interacted with them before because you've all worked in Street View from Google. So this concept here is that how do we capture a bigger field of view? We can do it by stitching multiple images together. We can stitch all the way around to get the full 360. We can pull up our phone and we can use panorama mode and we can swing our camera through. That's only going to give us about 180 degrees. You guys have probably all done that. Essentially what your camera is doing is it's on the fly combining images together. So when you swing your camera through that arc, you're getting all the images combined together for you, so you don't have to do any stitching after the fact. Today we're going to work with some actual stitching. We're going to take images that are apart and we're going to stitch them back together. Mechanics of it: the best panoramas are going to come when you isolate what's called the nodal point of the camera and you move around that point. It used to be something that when you got out a big camera, you could actually figure out where it was on the lens. And what that nodal point is, it's the point when your light comes through and it actually flips upside down as it goes through the lens. On a big camera, it's easy to find that. On our phones, it's really hard to find it because it's somewhere, in between the camera and the front screen. Right? It's really tiny. There's not a lot of distance there. The same thing, however, once you understand the point, can make a difference whether you're working on a phone or whether you're working on a bigger camera, etc. The reason that we care about this is because it eliminates something called parallax. And so I'll talk you through it in just a second. I'm going to skip 2 slides ahead and show you some examples so you understand what I'm talking about with parallax. So here, and you guys have seen this, I'm sure, in Street View, because Street View is full of parallax issues, where we've got these power lines, they don't quite connect correctly. That's an example of parallax. Those 2 lines on the edge, they don't quite line up correctly. That's parallax. These buildings, where one piece of the building doesn't quite line up with the other piece of the building, same thing. That's parallax. So how do we eliminate that problem? And so here's our mechanics here. To eliminate that problem, like I said, we find that nodal point and we move around that nodal point. And this is where everybody makes mistakes, is they look at it as this first example here. There I am shooting dead straight. Now, if I swing the camera and I try to take another picture, and you could do this with 2 objects that are in a line, if I swing the camera away, I'm going to get this result, where the first object swings away from the second object by the distortion of the lens. If, however, I move the camera back so that I'm isolating that nodal point, and I move the camera instead of this way, if I move around the camera, I can keep those 2 objects still in a line. And I'm going to remove those parallax errors. So what does that mean if we were actually shooting with our phone? Okay, everybody that takes panoramas and stuff or takes pictures, they do this. Right? That's what we all do. So instead, put your phone stationary and move around your phone. And you'll get far better results. So when it comes to actually shooting the panoramas in panorama mode, doesn't matter. But if you use like the Google Street View app to try to take a full 360 panorama, in that scenario, if you move around the camera, you get significantly better results. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the more closely you try to move, the better off you're going to be at getting good quality image results without those parallax errors. The problem with those parallax errors is they distract you, especially when it's something big like this. You see it, your eye catches on it, and you lose that immersive experience. So the final results, we can get an unrolled image. We could get an unrolled, you could do this with a high dynamic range, so we could get a panorama that is a high dynamic range. You could use that as your backdrop for a rendering. You can also get a virtual interactive movie or still that you can interact with and choose what you want to look at. And so either of those are available to us. So software that does this, guess what? Photoshop does it. That's what we're going to use today. It's available in the lab. It's great at stitching small groups of images. If you give it 40 or 50 images, it kind of has trouble. So small groups, we take 4 or 5 pictures and we stitch those together. That's not a problem. I'm giving you a full 360 sample today if you want to play around with it. You guys also tried to take some in your exercise 103. So start with yours, but if you want to play around with mine and throw it at it, that's perfectly fine. It's difficult to stitch a full 360-degree panorama using Photoshop. It's just not really built for that. There are some software packages outside that do full 360-degree panoramas. PTGUI is one. This is a paid option, but it's really good at what it does. And you can actually pick control points. You could say this in this image is this in that image, and it stitches the images together really, really nicely. Even better, there's a program called Huggin that is essentially the same thing, but it's free. It's an open source. So if you get into this and you want to play around with it, download this. It's free. You can stitch your images together. It's a great piece of software. It's a little bit slower, though, than the paid version, just at its processing. So you can definitely play around with it and explore a bit. So the other thing that we have is the Google Street View app that you can download on your phone. This allows you to stitch images together, and it's pretty funny. I was playing around with this. This was a number of years ago, and I was in Hawaii, and I was on the beach, and I'm like, the kids were playing, so I was like, okay, I'm going to just screw around with it and take some pictures and think about it for class. I got a notification like a year ago that my image had reached like 100,000 views or something ridiculous, and I didn't even realize that I posted it. So it's something that's out there. You guys can see it, and you can interact with it. It's not all of their Street View cameras. These are ones that people have taken. Generally, these tend to be a little bit better than their Street View cameras. For those of you that have been in an architecture studio and tried to use Street View, the problem with Street View is that it's always shot at about 11 feet. So it's up there. So it's not at eye level. So you get these really skewy perspectives down the road. This one, the ones that come from this app tend to be shot at eye level because that's where people have their phones. Anytime, they're great for outside. It does a great job stitching. If you're going to do something inside, you have to be real careful to move around your camera, or you're going to get those parallax issues. So if we were in this room and we wanted to take a full 360 of this room, you really want to be careful and move around your camera. Keep your camera in the same place as best you can to capture all those images. So I'll bring this up a little bit. It's kind of there. In terms of technology, it's becoming more relevant. And the idea that we can, instead of having a still, have a 360-degree video. And you can see the technology and the progress and where it's going, in that this is going to be something that's going to become very popular ultimately. But somehow the cardboard wearable isn't quite there. The non-cardboard wearable is really expensive. So it just really hasn't taken off just yet. But it is something that I like to point out that we're going that direction. And so now I think people are shooting these 360-degree videos with like mounted GoPros. It's like 6 or 7 GoPros around a ball, and you take the whole video. The other option is to shoot into a mirror or to use 2 or 3 lenses that are super wide angle and try to stitch those together. So it's an up-and-coming technology, but I at least like to point it out that it exists. There's actually a whole subsection on YouTube that has 360 video if you know where to look for it. Few examples here. I think the really important thing about looking at unrolled panoramas is that things in unrolled panoramas that are straight in real life appear curved in the panorama. Things that are curved in real life appear straight in a panorama. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. The other thing is when you're taking all of those images, if you make a mistake and you have an image that isn't exposed correctly, like that one, it happens to be the same image as that one, you get these weird artifacts that happen. So this is something that I have a version where I corrected that in Photoshop after the fact, but you want to be aware that that's a problem. So you want to make sure you lock that exposure if you're taking lots and lots of images. The other thing you have to make sure of is that you actually capture all the images. So I took this 360 panorama and missed a couple images. And so that's problematic when you go to stitch it together. Now, could I go in and clone stamp in Photoshop and make that go away? Sure. But the point is you want to make sure you capture all of those images. So remember what I said about things that are straight appear curved. Things that are curved appear straight. This looks like several straight lines. Therefore, it's curved. It's actually shot from the very center of that Incan agricultural center. My words are tied up today. I'm just not spitting them out correctly. Anyway, we shot it right there at the center. So all of those concentric rings become the straight walls when you unroll it. I think it's a good illustration of that difference. This is one example set that I think I give you today if you want to play around with. The other thing that happens with these images is because you're stitching multiple images together, you end up with a really high resolution. And so when you're done stitching this one, for example, you can actually look out here and see all the way across the valley and see the detail through the doorway because there's so many images that combine to make this one higher quality image. More examples there. Just a pair of shoes. Didn't quite get removed. So that's the other thing. Just like with the high dynamic range images, it's composed of multiple images that are shot at different times. So you can actually get ghosting of how people move through a space because of all these images. This is an example here with a lot of that ghosting happening. If you guys move on to Berkeley, Worcester Hall, actually looks a little bit different now because they've added on a whole 3D printing lab and whatever to it. I like this image because it shows you that same problem with the exposures being different. So this ended up not being a particularly good image. This is also much, much harder to correct afterward because of the detail. You know, photoshopping a little sky is easy. Correcting this is a lot harder. And really, this is how you'd see the building because you're there all night. So side note about the building, all of the floors have photocells on them, so they're responsive to people moving. And it's very entertaining at night to see which floors stay on and which floors don't. So 3 and 4, it's like landscape and city planning floors. Those guys go off at like 5. They're out of there. As you move your way up, 5, 6, those are early studios, you know, younger undergraduates and whatever. You know, they do pretty well. They might make it to 11, maybe 1. Top floor, 9th floor, those lights never go off, ever. So it's just one of those kind of entertaining things to see when you guys move on. You'll actually become really interested in that. So here's a entertaining blast from the past. When we were playing around with panoramas, this is about 2003. So this is early panoramas, early stitching, and all that kind of thing. We decided to make fun of the idea that you could, when you stitch, you can take yourself and put yourself in every one of the images. So in this case, we have ourselves in every one of the images. So there's lots of copies of ourselves. It's me when I actually had some hair. It's kind of entertaining. Another example here. This was in a really tight space. We were looking at a space capsule, and so I decided to take a panorama while we were there. And the reason that I put this together is right there. You get a half a person. I wasn't paying that much attention when I snapped those images, and you really have to watch out for those kinds of things, which is a good example of the errors that can happen. This one was on the Brooklyn Bridge. This was shot completely by hand, but there's no parallaxing errors because I was careful to move around the camera instead of the other way around. So I'm going to start flipping through these because they all kind of look the same. So a lot of these images are from my thesis. My whole thesis centered around panoramas and panoramic photography. So I studied these for a long time and became really interested in them. And then I grew up and haven't thought about it since. In the process, just for the fun of it, I actually had to learn how to draw a panoramic perspective. So you actually have to bend things through an arc to get the curvature. And so I did all of these drawings. So there's a section on the right that had to be brought through and then drawn. There was no way to do it by hand. I had to use a computer to kind of set it up. But it was pretty fun. These are examples of some of the drawings at the end. This one was a 21-foot drawing when it was done, when it was all printed, and it had ghosted images cut on the back, and it was a pretty cool thing. I don't know whatever happened to it. I used to have it somewhere, but it's not there anymore. So, oh, and by the way, don't ask me what my thesis is about because I don't remember. It's been long enough. Okay, so we're going to switch over. Let's do, it hasn't been that long. I haven't talked for that long. Let's just go straight into it. Give me a second to switch over, and then we'll get through it, and then you guys can take your break afterward. Okay, so we're going to continue right along here into exercise 106. There's two parts today. We have part 1, which is dealing with the high dynamic range photo, and part 2, which is dealing with the panoramic photo. I'm actually going to flip and do the part 2 section first because I think it will help illustrate the masking a little bit better. You can do them in order. It doesn't make any difference. But in terms of my demo, I think it'll help explain masking just a little bit better. I've gone ahead and I've already opened Photoshop. And the reason that I opened Photoshop is that way I didn't have to sit here and log in while you guys were watching me. You guys will obviously have to log in. Remember to click on the button for the Enterprise ID. Log in with your Enterprise ID, and then you can log in with the DVC Insight email. So I'm open just to the splash screen here. I actually am not going to open something just yet because I need to combine those images together. And when I do that, it's going to be done using an automated Photoshop action. I don't actually have to start with anything open. So to start, I'm just going to go up to the File menu, and I'm going to come down into the Automate menu. These automatic actions are processes that Photoshop has been trained to do. And when we get to dealing with these, it makes it a lot easier so we don't have to do it. So I'm going to come all the way down. My last option is Photomerge. Notice right above it is Merge to HDR Pro. We're going to use that in the second half today. But this Photomerge option is essentially going to allow us to pick groups of images and combine them together. Here we go. So in the Photomerge little window that pops up here, we're going to leave the layout set to auto. That means it's going to figure it out for us, which is always nice. And we need to go get some files. Now, you should have a few images from your exercise 103 that overlap, and you should be able to use those. Maybe 3, 5 images, something like that. If you don't have those images, or you don't like those images, or they didn't stitch particularly well, you can go to today's exercise. And at the bottom, I have several groups of samples. So right down here, we're in the sample like I said, I'm struggling to talk today. Sample panoramic image set 1, set 2, and set 3. You can choose any one of those. For some reason, my finished panoramas aren't working. I don't know what went wrong. I went to pull them up today, and they stopped working. So some update killed it. So I'll have to work on the plugin and figure out what happened. Anyway, so you can't see the interactive ones. But you can download these sample sets. These sample sets are large. There's, I think, 46 or 48 images. It's a full 360-degree panorama, so you'll get all the way around. So you may only end up picking a group of those images. I'm going to go ahead and click on Browse. I already have them downloaded, so I'm not going to download them myself. And let me go into today's folder. There's my panoramas. And so I have all 3 set up. I'm going to work with this first set here. And as I go and select the images, I'm going to select groups of images. So in this case, like I said, I'm not throwing all the images at it. I might take these 4 images. I'll find the matching 4 images that are for the, oops, sorry, I meant to hold down Control. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. And let's take 1, 2, 3. And let's take a couple high. Yeah, that should work. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And so it's loaded in a group of those images. Now here's the cool thing, is that we have blend images together checked. That's great. And so when we click OK, Photoshop's actually going to process this for us. So when we say OK, you're going to see Photoshop start to work. So it opens up. And we can also see that the layer menu is going to start to evolve here. So it's opening up those various pieces of the image. Then it's going to try to look at the images and align them based on what's in the image. Sorry, I can't make it go any faster than it is currently going. So now it's starting to blend those layers. So you see the layers have changed a little bit. OK, so when it's done, you can see that I missed a few pieces in the images that I chose. But that's OK, because it still illustrates the point. So as I zoom in here, oh, it actually did yeah, because I'm missing this image, it did a pretty bad job. There's 2 errors right there. But if we look down here, let's look at, like here, for example. We can't tell where one image starts and where the other image ends, because Photoshop has gone in and they've merged those 2 images together. And the way that they do this is they take each of the images. Let me turn that. Let's find. OK, that's a good one. That's a good one. We're going to turn off the others. So I've simplified this down such that I have just 2 images showing. So let's look at the first image right here. So the whole image, the first thing Photoshop does is it says, OK, well, we're in perspective, so I need to adjust this image, and I need to warp that image to compensate for the camera and the bending of the camera. So you see that the rectangular image has been switched into this shape. So it kind of warped out the image. The next thing it does is it adds what's called a layer mask to it that cuts off part of the image here. That's the part that's going to interact with the image next to it. If I turn that image off for a second and I look at this image, same thing applies here. Oops, sorry. There's the whole image. So it starts by warping that image. And then it applies a layer mask so that the only parts of the image that are shown are here. So it's warp first and then cut out part of the image. And by cutting those pieces out, we end up getting a seamless connection between the image that's next to it. Does that kind of make sense? So this mapping, or excuse me, this masking is what controls what parts of the image are seen and what parts of the image are not seen. So let's look at that one image again here. So this image here, if we look at our layer palette, we have the first little box here shows a little preview of our image itself. And I know it's really small, but you see the overall page size, and then you see a little color square that is our image itself. Next to it, we have here, this is the mask that's applied on the layer. This mask, anything that is black has become transparent, and anything that is white is still showing. So the black area is kind of like spraying it with spray paint that makes it go away. And the part that's white is the part that is shown. So we can actually modify this mask by working just directly on that mask. And that's what we're going to do in the high dynamic range section in just a second. So I'll leave this put together, and I'll let you guys play around with the whole Photomerge idea. When you're done, you'll save this for, it's export as, whatever it is. Export as, and then you'll change this to a JPEG just like you've done in the past. When it comes to the high dynamic range image, again, you'll want to download the sample files or use your samples. I already have mine available on the flash drive, so I won't go get them. There they are, HDR image samples 1, 2, and 3. You can use any of those, or you can use your own. Obviously, it would be good to try to use your own, see if you can make it work. Once again, it is an automatic action, so we'll go down to the File menu, we'll go to Automate, and this time we'll choose Merge to HDR Pro. And it brings up this dialog box, which is basically saying, where are your files? Where are your images? So I'm going to go ahead and go to Browse, and they are once again in my 106 folder, and there's the sample set 1, 2, and 3. I'll do this a couple times. I'll pick sample set 2 for right now. There's my 3 images, 1, 2, and 3. Remember, correctly exposed, underexposed, and overexposed. Let me hold down Shift and select all of them. I'll go ahead and say OK. And there's my 3 images. You want to make sure that this is checked. Attempt to automatically align source images, because obviously we want to make sure if there's subtle shifts, we'll get them aligned. And I'll go ahead and say OK. Okay, so then we get the Merge to HDR Pro dialog box here. And this is what's really improved in the new Creative Cloud versus CS6, which is what we were on before. And that is that there are a bunch of presets that you can play around with to see if one of these is a better option. So I could go to photorealistic low contrast, for example. I could go to photorealistic high contrast and see what happens. Okay, that doesn't look as good. I could go to saturated. That's not too bad. And you could go through a bunch of these options, some of which might not be the best. So I would encourage you to play around with those. The other thing that you can do is you can start to play around with certain sliders that will help you. So if we wanted the shadows in this image, so the dark areas to become lighter, we can drag the shadow slider, and you can see the dark areas of the image become lighter. Likewise, we could take the light areas of the image and we could darken those up. And so you can play around with that as well. You want to get the image looking as good as it can. I'm going to go back to the photorealistic low contrast, I think, and then I'll go ahead and say OK. And that then gives me the high dynamic range image. I'm going to continue to work with this in just a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and do one more of those Merge to HDR so you can see it again. I'll go to File, Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. I'll browse. I'm going to use a different set of images this time. Same thing, attempt to automatically align source images. I'll go ahead and say OK. All right, so here we are. So same thing, I can go through my various options here. That seems a bit dark. No, I'm going to stick with just the photorealistic, this one. Even though it's a bit dark, I'll make that correction afterwards. So I'll go ahead and say OK. And now that I've created the high dynamic range image, I'm going to start to work on processing it. So in this scenario, first thing I would do is I would go up to my layer, I go to New Adjustment Layer, and I go to Levels. And I do a Levels adjustment, which we've already done. You can see that the white point is way off here. I'm going to pull that back to brighten that up. And so that by itself can make a big difference. Next thing I'll do is I'll go on and I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to go to Curves. And on this Curves adjustment, I'm going to pay attention just to the sky. So I'll ignore the rest of the image. So maybe I want a little bit more contrast in the sky, maybe like that, for example. Okay, so that's fine. Notice on the Curves layer, though, there's the curve itself, and then there's a white box automatically created. That is a mask. Remember, everything that is white in that mask is shown. So if I select the mask right there, I go over to my paintbrush, which is right here, and I paint in black, so I'm going to flip my color so it's black. I just push that little double-sided arrow next to my colors here. Whatever I paint is going to not have the curves adjustment applied to it. Let me make my brush a little bit bigger so you guys can see it. All right, good. So I'm on the mask, and whatever I paint isn't going to have that adjustment applied to it. Do you guys see how that starts to change? So I can make the brush bigger. I'll use the bracket key to make this a little bit bigger, and I'll go ahead and paint in this lower part of the image. Now, when it comes to getting up here toward the top, I'll have to spend a little bit more time, and I'll probably need a smaller brush, and I'll have to work my way right along that edge there. Like that. I might even need a smaller brush. Oops. Sorry, I hit the wrong key to get in there. Now, sometimes you make a mistake. Oops, didn't mean to do that. On a mask, it's pretty easy because all we have to do is flip our color back to being white, and I could get that right back. So I'll paint that back over like so. So we have some flexibility with how that mask is applied. If you look at my mask, you see that the white area is where that curve is applied. The black area is where it is not. So if we look at the whole image and we turn on and turn off that mask, you should see that it's affecting only the sky. It looks like I missed a few pieces down in the corner, but you get the idea. Let me show you another example, and I'll use this to help illustrate this mask again. I'm going to go ahead and turn this image into black and white. So I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. We're going to go to a Channel Mixer, and I'm going to turn the channel mixer to monochrome, and I would go through the presets and decide which one looked the best. Okay, let's assume that it's that one for right now. Same thing here, where I can paint and have the black and white not apply. So I'll make sure I click on the mask itself. I'll paint using the brush tool with black. I need to make that brush bigger. I'll use the bracket key to make it a little bit bigger. And now I could paint, for example, the sky. And that would come back as blue, the rest of this still being in black and white. You can see right there that we're seeing a preview of it. Now, in this scenario, as I got in a little bit finer, I don't want my brush to have as soft of an edge as it does. So I'm going to change this hardness value up to 100%. What this does, and I'll show you two examples, is in this scenario, can you guys see that? No, you can't see that. Hold on a second. Let me just do it again really quick. Okay. So same thing here. I'm working on my mask. If I have the brush here, sometimes you're just not having a good day. I apologize. Okay. Here we go. In our brush, I have my hardness set to 100%. When I paint, I'm going to get a sharp circle. The alternative to that is to set the hardness at 0%, and I'm going to get a soft circle. You guys see how that works? So if I switch and I have the hardness somewhere in the middle, I'm going to get a sharp circle with a little bit of a fade on the edge. So if I go in and I try to paint along this edge here, if I have too much softness, I'm going to get too much spillover into the background here. So in that scenario, that's okay. I'm getting a little bit of color there. The other option, of course, would be to be a smaller brush. And furthermore, I could go back and I'm going to adjust the hardness all the way up. I'm going to flip my colors into white, and I can try to get this as tight as I possibly could right in there. Right, to kind of fill that back in. So sometimes it takes a combination of both strategies. So I could flip my color again, and I could work my way along with the color. So you see I went over right there. I can flip my color back. And so I can work my way along. You guys get the idea. I don't want you to have to sit and watch me fill things in. But that's how I would work with it. So what I want you to do today in the high dynamic range image, get it to where it looks good, but then start to really manipulate it. Because I want you to have practice with these masks. So let's say that I wanted to, I did the black and white. We could go in and we could do a, let's do, a hue and saturation adjustment. Just for the sake of having fun here. Okay, I'll turn the water purple. I can do the same thing where I control just the water or just the sky using that mask. So I'd be on the mask. I'd go to my brush. I'd paint with black. There's black. And I'd paint everything around the water. So let's make this a little bit bigger here. And I'll paint that. We'll paint this. Right? And then I'd spend a little bit of time kind of fine-tuning it. But I'm now able to control just the color of the water. Does that make sense? So really this is about masking. It's learning the process of masking, being able to create the mask. I don't care what the end image looks like. So you could totally butcher the end image, that's fine. What I care about is that you understand masking and can figure out how to mask certain pieces of the image without masking other pieces of the image. Okay? So today you're going to do two things. They're all going to show up in just one post. So you'll have a panorama, which would be this one. And you'll have a high dynamic range image that has a bunch of masking applied to it. So you can use black and white, you can use levels, you can use basically anything you can think of. It does also work using the filters. So I could go in, I think. Oh, all right, sorry, wrong. Let me work on a copy here just in case. Let me add a layer mask. You can create a layer mask by clicking on that Add Layer Mask. And then let me apply the sorry, wrong here. Right, so there it is. I pixelated it, but I have that mask, so I can control where it applies. So all I have to do is paint with black on here, and I get the image back itself. Okay, so just more options. It doesn't really matter what you do. I just want you to experience this whole idea. Okay, so I'm going to turn you guys loose. Really spend time playing around with this. You've got a lot of time today because I want you to feel very comfortable with the whole masking scenario. Okay, so take your time. We will use it next class a lot, so it's important to kind of get ready, get comfortable with it, and then we'll keep working our way forward.